welcome to the very last talk of the 2010-2011 Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Seminar Series. It's nice to see a robust audience on our final week. I wanted to just, as we end the year, give a special thanks to our sponsors, who include the Center for Society and Genetics, the Department of Anthropology, the Division of Social Sciences, the Coates Institute for Archaeology, the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and the Interdisciplinary Relationship Sciences Program. So thank you to all of them. And Dan has a couple of announcements, and then I will introduce our speaker.
Before we close the series for the year, I just wanted to thank Professor Brooks-Shelsa for a wonderful series. And also, I wanted to thank our back assistant, Leo Tiokin. The sad news is Leo will be leaving us as the back assistant this year. The good news is he will be joining us as a first-year graduate student in biological anthropology in that next year. So we look forward to that. Thank you.
Okay, and so for our last talk of the year, Charles Perreault from our own UCLA Department of Anthropology is here, and his talk is entitled The Pace of Cultural Evolution, and he is about to defend his doctoral dissertation on this very topic.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Beck has been one of the most important learning experiences for me here at UCLA in the last 5 years. So I was relieved when the world didn't end last Saturday at 6 p.m. because I'm very happy to speak to you here today. So I want to talk to you about some of my research on the question of the evolution of social learning. And the question of this research is part of a larger anthropological research endeavor in which we are trying to explain why is it that humans have come to dominate so many of the Earth's ecosystem. So today, between 1/3 and 1/2 of all land surface on the planet has been transformed by human action, and more than 1/2 of all accessible surface fresh water on the planet is being used by humans. And today we live in an environment as diverse as, an ecosystem as diverse as the Amazonian jungle, the Saharan desert, and very harsh environment like Tibet and Mongolia. I know it's hard to tell from this picture, but it gets very, very cold in Mongolia in the winter. And starting in the 60s, we even have humans traveling in space. And it really seems like it's only a matter of time before we have humans going on and colonizing other planets. And there are no other mammal species that can do that. There are simply no other mammal species that has enjoyed the ecological success that we've enjoyed in the last 50,000 years or so. So in that regard, our species poses a pretty interesting evolutionary problem. And one of my main research goals is to explain, how did we get to this? And the working hypothesis here is that one of the key factors generating our evolutionary success is that we have the capacity to socially learn from each other, so to transmit information from each other's brains that affect our behavior. So I don't think I need to expand on this in this audience, but this is cultural information. It is useful and important to contrast this with information that affect your behavior, but that you've acquired genetically. So that it was transmitted genetically from your parents, and that is coded in your DNA. And information that you've acquired individually, so through individual learning, through trial and error and experience. So with that in mind, I want to talk to you about 2 research projects. The first research project is a collaborative work that I'm doing with Christina and Rob here. And here we are using a Bayesian approach to study the evolution of social learning. And in the second project, I am testing the hypothesis that cultural evolution is faster than biological evolution in general. And I can tell you right now that I'm going to argue that one of the reasons why culture makes us increase our adaptability is that it improves the accuracy of the learning process, and also because it allows us to evolve adaptations over a shorter time scale than biological evolution does. So the first project, we use Bayesian tools to understand the evolution of social learning. So there's been much interest in that problem, and many researchers have tried to understand when is it that natural selection will favor individuals who pay attention to social information. And another research question is how should natural selection shape the imitation process when individuals have access to more than one models, and when these different models exhibit different behaviors. And the work done so far on this topic has tended to borrow tools from population genetics. And this body of work has been immensely useful and influential. But one problem with it is that it requires you to specify in advance which learning rule you're going to study. So what you typically end up doing is you compare the expected fitness of individuals following a certain learning rule that you have defined a priori with the learning rule of other individuals, with the expected fitness of other individuals following another learning rule, which you will also have defined a priori. And one problem with this approach is that, not too surprisingly, it has led to some lack of consensus about which learning rule is adaptive, because everybody's studying a slightly different learning rule. So for instance, there's some disagreement about the conditions under which conformism can evolve. But then you go in the literature and then you realize that, well, these people are in this model, individuals conform to 3 individuals, and in this other model here, individuals are conforming to 10 individuals. So what we did here is instead of coming up a priori with a learning rule to study, we are letting that rule evolve. Okay? And the population genetics approach to the evolution of social learning has also been criticized on the grounds that it treats individual and social learning as psychologically distinct processes, while in fact they are both just cue-based inferences about the world. So what we did here is we built a theoretical model in which both individual and social learning arise from the same single learning process. So we start by assuming that individuals' main adaptive problem is to choose the best behavior in a variable environment. So this is a problem that individuals from any animal species have to solve. There are often many different behavioral alternatives, and given your knowledge of the world, you have to decide which one is best for you. So be it, should you stay on this tree or move to the next one, or given how harsh last spring was, should you be laying 2, 3, or 4 eggs? And this is a problem that is solved by learning things about the world. And here we've modeled learning as a Bayesian inference. So here individuals are trying to infer the current state of their environment using 2 sources of information. So first, they observe the behavior of individuals from their parents' generation, so that this is the social cue. And then they also learn something on their own from the environment, so individual learning. So this is the environmental cue. But now the quality of that environmental cue can vary. So some things are harder to learn than others, or some things can be learned with greater accuracy than others. So let's say, for instance, you are a hunter and you come back to your home base empty-handed for several days in a row. Well, that's a pretty clear cue that game is rare right now, that perhaps you should either switch foraging strategy or move to another location. But things are harder to learn on your own, like, is Diet Coke really better for your health than normal Coke? It's hard to tell. Or what causes malaria? So, the chances that you see the causal arrow between the mosquito bite and the fever that you will develop days, but sometimes weeks or months later, are pretty slim. And in fact, people had a very long theory of malaria until very recently. They thought it was coming from breathing bad air, so malaria, bad air. And some things are just costly to learn. Right? My legs are a little bit here. So like which plant and mushroom species are edible in your environment. This is something you can learn on your own by trying out and sampling every plant and mushroom species in your environment. You're going to learn something all right by doing that, but you could also get very sick or even die. So this is part of the adaptive challenge that we're trying to capture with our model. And here one prediction could be that natural selection might favor reliance on social information when individual learning is hard or costly or inaccurate. So you know, just eat what mom eats, and if mom doesn't eat something, then don't. So right there, that's a very quick and cheap way to learn stuff about your environment. But social learning also has its costs. So if the state of the environment has recently changed, then it's possible that the social information available to you is outdated. So for instance, if the climate is warming up, then perhaps the way your father used to hunt is not the optimal foraging strategy for you right now. So there's a trade-off problem between relying on environmental information and relying on social information. And this is a trade-off problem that natural selection has to solve. And here we are trying to derive the learning rule that will maximize individuals' fitness when learning is based on both social and environmental information. So the setting of our model is very classic in the Boyd and Richardson 1985 sense of it. So there are two environmental states, wet and dry, and the state of the environment changes every time period with the fixed probability gamma. And there are two behavioral alternatives, behavior 1 and behavior 2. And behavior 1 is favored in the wet state, and behavior 2 is favored in the dry state. And if you have the right behavior in the right environmental state, you get a fitness benefit. So you have a higher fitness relative to the individuals with the behavioral alternative. And individuals have access to two sources of information. So they get a social cue X, which is a value randomly drawn from a normal distribution, with a mean mu in the wet state and with a mean minus mu in the dry state. So that on average, a positive Q tells you you are in a wet state, and a negative Q tells you you are in a dry state. So mu is in some sort of measure of how accurately X predicts the state of the environment, with larger mu values meaning greater accuracy. And then individuals also have access to a social cue Y, which is the number of individuals, the number n of individuals among, the number of individuals among the n models randomly sampled from its parent generation that exhibit behavior 1. So here n equals 4, so the individuals observe 4 models from its parent generation, and 3 out of these 4 models exhibit behavior 1, so y equals 2. Another question for the individual is, given that I observe QX, and given that 3 out of my 4 models exhibit behavior 1, what is the chance that I am in a wet state right now? And this is a question that can be framed in Bayesian terms, in terms of conditional probabilities. So this is the probability that you are in a wet state, so we've quoted wet as 1 and dry as 2, that you are in a wet state given Qx and y. Okay? And this is going to be greater than 0.5 when this here is true. So when this is true here, the chances that you are in a wet state are greater than the chances that you are in a dry state. So that all other things being equal, you should choose behavior 1. And now we're going to assume that y is binomially distributed, and that x, as I said earlier, is normally distributed with mu and minus mu and variance v. But we've set v to 1, so it's going to disappear pretty quickly. And with these assumptions, Bayesian inference tells you that you should choose behavior 1 when this is true here. So remember, y is the social cue, x is the environmental cue, n is the number of models you observe, and g is a parameter that depends on mu and q. So the mean of the environmental cue distribution, and q is the frequency of the favored behavior in the environment. And notice that these are two features of the world that individuals do not have access to. So what we're doing is we assume that G is an inheritable parameter, that it is a trait of individual psychology. And we are letting natural selection learn about mu and Q by shaping G. Okay? And notice also that this learning rule here is always satisfied when both Q's point in the same direction and they both tells you that you are in a wet state. and that this equation is never satisfied when both cues point in the same direction and tell you you are in a dry state. But the challenge for the individuals is to decide what to do when both cues are pointing in different directions. So when y is greater than n over 2, so it tells you you are in a wet state, and when x is negative. And when that happens, it is when that happens that G matters. Because G will specify how that conflict between the cues should be resolved. So for instance, if G is small, it tells you that in case of conflict between the cues, you should put more weight on the social information. Okay, so, and that, unless you get a very large X value, so a very large negative or very large positive value, meaning that it's more likely to be accurate, you should just imitate. So what we did is we built that learning rule into a system of recursions that we have numerically iterated. And we have 4,000 alleles, each coding for a different value of G, ranging from 0 to 20, which proved to be sufficiently large. And then we let the run start, and every time period the environment changes with probability gamma. And every time period we calculate how the frequency of these alleles changes depending on their expected fitness. And then we did that until we reached some steady state genotypic frequency. And we also did that by varying all the parameters in the model. So we have a lot of results, but I just want to show you some results that illustrate the general logic of the model. Now, because G values are hard to interpret biologically, we've computed the learning rule, the equilibrium learning rule for the different equilibrium G values that we got. So here you're looking at the probability of acquiring a favored behavior as a function of its frequency in the population. And there are two benchmarks on this chart. First, the horizontal red line is the probability that you acquired a favored behavior through individual learning alone. So without paying any attention to social information. And notice that this probability is very high here because mu is large. So it's easy to learn on your own. Okay? And the identity line that runs at the center of the chart is the probability that you acquired a favorite trait simply by imitating one randomly individual's sample from the previous generation. So pure, unbiased social learning. And now we can judge the importance of social and environmental information for the different equilibrium learning rule by asking how close they are from these two extremes. So here you're looking at the equilibrium learning rule for when individuals have access to one model, so when n equals 1 in blue, and when individuals have access to 8 models, n equals 8. And you can see that in both cases, natural selection is favoring individuals who put a lot of weight on environmental information. And that's not too surprising because individual learning is so accurate here. There's not much room for improvement. So things get more interesting when the quality of the environmental information is low. So here you're looking at the same thing.
What's the variance in the environments? Mu is the mean,
and
it's set to 1.
It's set to 1 all the time. Yeah. So here you're looking at the same thing, but here individual learning is much lower, so mu is lower. So the probability that you acquired a favorite trait through individual learning alone is barely above 50%. So if you're individually learning, you're doing only slightly better than someone who's flipping a coin to decide what to do. And you can see that in both cases, natural selection is favoring a much greater reliance on social information. So the equilibrium learning rules are much closer to what you would expect from a pure social learner. But notice here that the frequency of the favorite traits in the population of social learner here can be much higher than what would be possible in the population of pure individual learner. And that's more surprising than we might think, because ultimately all that social information in the population at some point comes from individuals who have learned on their own. Okay? So what's going on here? So what's going on is that here, when there's a conflict between the two cues, individuals are putting a lot of weight on social information. And unless they get a very accurate environmental cue, they imitate. And so that it allows individuals to make a selective use of environmental information. So that every generation, individuals don't have to start learning from scratch about the environment, but they can rely on, they can start from where the last generation was. So that through time, the accuracy of social information increases. I notice also the effect of conformism here, and to a lesser extent here, as individuals are observing more than one model. So as individuals are observing more than one model, they become increasingly more likely to disproportionately adopt the dominant trait in the population. So this is conformist bias transmission. And we find the effect of conformism throughout pretty much all of our parameter space, which suggests that conformism could be a universal aspect of social learning. And this was exciting because remember, we didn't specify a conformist bias in our learning. This is really something that's emerging out of the model. And understanding the conditions under which conformism evolves is important because for many reasons, and notably because for many people it is thought to have played an important role in setting the conditions right for the evolution of things like large-scale cooperation. And we can also show that the expected fitness increases with social learning. So here looking at the expected fitness as a function of the probability that the environmental cue is correct. And notice that, so in red you've got the expected fitness of the equilibrium learning rule, and in blue the expected fitness of pure individual learner. And notice that the relative fitness benefit of social learning increases as the quality of the environmental cue increases. And that illustrates the utility of these models in that they allow us to make some predictions or about what kind of environment or what kind of adaptive challenge might make in sort that paying attention to social information will be favored under the eyes of natural selection. And the Bayesian approach to that question, first it led us to replicate much of the results that have been reached through the population genetic approach, which suggests that all these results are fairly robust, and they probably don't hinge on the specificity of any of these learning mechanism or modeling technique. And we did all that without making the assumption that individual and social learning are distinct processes. And also I think that by showing that the extent of conformism, the evolution of conformism is likely to depend on the number of models observed, I think we might have explained why some peoples have reached different conclusions about the evolution of conformism. So now I want to talk to you about another research project of mine in which I am trying to measure how fast culture changes. So one of the main reasons frequently invoked to explain our ecological success is that cultural variation and cultural innovation accumulate in the population through time. And this allows for complex cultural adaptations to evolve. And the rationale here is that because this culture evolution process is faster on average than biological evolution, it allows humans to adapt more rapidly to the ecosystem than other animals. And this idea that culture is faster than biological evolution really underpins, I think, our understanding of the history of our species. And yet the evidence for it is anecdotal at best. There are simply no systematic comparisons of rates of cultural change and rates of biological change. And what is more, we don't even know how much faster culture is, if at all, compared to biological evolution. And the study of rates of change has a long history in paleontology and biology. So what I did is I borrowed the methods developed in these fields and I've applied it to the archaeological record. So one of the reasons why I think that hypothesis has never been properly tested is that for many people it's a no-brainer. It's just obvious that culture can change more rapidly than biological systems. Well, first, how something obvious seems is a very poor epistemological criteria by which to judge a statement. And second, when you think about it, I don't think it's that clear that biological evolution is slower than cultural evolution. There are many instances of very rapid biological change. And I'm not just talking about fruit flies in a lab. Talking about mammals in the wild. So species like the polar bear has evolved, has accumulated all its adaptation to Arctic environment in less than 20,000 years. And this is not just a change in the color of the fur. This is like, we're talking about a significant change in the body morphology, the morphology of the skull, a change in the diet and the foraging behaviors. These animals are carnivorous animals, and they've evolved from a species of brown bear that's omnivorous. And humans provide us with another example of rapid biological evolution. So recent genetic analysis suggests that Tibetans have evolved their adaptation to high altitude environments, to one of the harshest environments on the planet in a mere 3,000 years. Okay, so very rapid. And Neolithic farmers have evolved adaptation to lactose, tolerance to lactose over relatively similar time scale. So on the one hand, biology can change, biological evolution can be rapid. And on the other hand, while theoretically culture has the potential to change instantaneously, pretty much everything we know from anthropological and psychological research tells us that it's really going to be the case. So things like conformism that I've talked about earlier are going to act against rapid change in individuals' behavior. The same could be said about things like ethnic group signaling. And when you think about cultural norms or economical norms, it's easy to see that as soon as an individual deviates from these norms, he or she will be punished, right? At the very least, pay a cost. So much so that economical system like métayage, which is a sharecropping system that has survived from the Roman period well into the 20th century in southern France and Italy. So this is a system in which you cultivate someone else's land and then you share the crop with the landowner. And the archaeological record is filled with technologies that are very stable through time. So microblade technologies appear in Eurasia shortly after the last glacial maximum, so 17,000 years ago. And they remain part of hunter-gatherers' toolkit well into the Holocene. So this is a technology that stays the same for thousands of years. So over a longer time period, a longer period of time than it took for these guys to evolve adaptations to the Tibetan plateau. But now you might dismiss this example because you think microblade technologies, that's a pretty simple technology. Well, I would dare you to produce a microblade right now. It takes a lot of skill. But here's an example of a very complex technology, the Japanese sword. And the steps involved in making a Japanese sword are very complex, and yet these steps have remained essentially the same for nearly 800 years. So it has almost disappeared 60, 70 years ago during the post-war American occupation of Japan, where it was illegal to make or bear arms. But right after that, it came back. And today, the way these swords are made is exactly the same way that they were made before. So here's how to make a Japanese sword. So the Japanese sword is a cutting tool. So it's made to be used with a slashing action, like a sweeping stroke, which is what you want when you're riding a horse. So it's not the same than European swords, which are often made to be used with a thrusting action. So what you want is a very hard and sharp edge that will cut through leather, metal, flesh, and bone, and won't chip while doing that. And at the same time, you want a sword that is tough enough so that it won't break if it's struck hard by another sword, which is rather embarrassing. But so these swords are made of steel, and when it comes to steel, hard and tough don't go well together. So for a blade to be sharp, it has to be hard, and hard steel brittles easily. Okay, so there's a trade-off between toughness and hardness, and this is a trade-off this is a problem that Japanese swordsmiths have solved beautifully. So when you make a Japanese sword, you just typically start with steel ores. So steel is mostly made of iron, but it has a little bit of carbon in it. And the amount of carbon in it will determine how hard the steel is. And you typically start with ores that contain twice as much carbon as what you want. So what you do is you heat up the metal and you hammer it. And every time you do that, some of the carbon is burned away. And you keep doing that until using some visual cues. So you keep doing that until using some visual cues, you feel that you've got steel with the right amount of carbon. But of course you do all that without any theory of iron or carbon. Okay? And then you let the metal cool down and you break it into pieces. Because at this point the carbon is not homogeneously distributed in the steel. So what you do is you discard the pieces that are too bright and silvery, which we know now means that they have too much carbon in it. And you also discard the dark pieces, which have a lower amount of carbon, meaning that they are softer. But you discard the dark pieces, but you reserve them, so you're going to need these later. Okay, and then what you do is you put the pieces back together in a single block. And then you heat it up and you hammer it. And this is a lot of work because at this point you really want a very homogeneous steel. So what you do is you heat it up and then you start folding it. And you fold it again and you fold it again. So essentially this is just like making croissants. And you keep doing that about 13, 15 times. And at the end of it, you will have about 16,000 layers of steel per inch of thickness. It's quite impressive. And then when it's still bright hot, you make a deep V-cut to it. And then you go back to the dark discarded piece, which are softer, and you make a core. And you insert that core into the V-cutted piece. And so this is what you get. And then you hammer it, you heat it up and you hammer it again because you want these two pieces to be perfectly bound together. And this procedure creates a sword that is hard and can be sharp on the outside, but that is soft and tough on the back and inside. And then you have to shape that block into a nice blade, and just doing that is 2-3 years of apprenticeship. And then you have to shape it into a nice blade, and this is also a lot of work because you want a curved blade, and as you hammer it, the blade will tend to bend towards the thin side of it, while you want it to bend towards the thicker side of it. And then once you've got your nice shaped blade, which is, again, a couple of years of apprenticeship, you need to make it hard. So for steel to be very hard, it has to cool down very rapidly. So if you just let the sword cool down in the air, it will never develop the hardness to make a usable blade. So what you do is you take some clay and you make a slurry with it. And then what you do is you cover the blade with that slurry. And you cover the edge of the blade with a paper-thin layer of it. And then you cover the back of the blade with a thicker layer of it. Because what you want to make in sword that the blade cools down rapidly at the edge, but cools down more slowly on the back. And by controlling the placement of the clay on the blade, you're able to create a differential crystalline structure in the steel, which will affect its hardness. And you also want to leave perpendicular thin stripes of clay on the blade, and these will insulate the metal under it, and it will create a tooth-like pattern of soft steel that will prevent the extent of damage if the blade starts to chip. And then once you're done with that, you heat it bright red hot. So you have to heat at a very, very high temperature. And yeah, so you have to heat that thing, it's 2-3 feet long, without disturbing the clay anywhere. And then what you do is you put it very rapidly into cold water. And you do all this in the middle of the night because you want to be able to really judge the true color of the blade. And so then you put it into cold water, but putting bright red hot steel into cold water is asking for trouble because the blade can just twist and crack like that. And this is a blade that you have worked on for perhaps weeks, okay? And actually half of the time the swordsmith loses its work there. And even the best one lose at least 25% of their sword at this step. And then once, if your blade has survived the quenching process, you need to polish it, to sharpen it, to ornate it, to mount it. So I'm going to skip these steps here, but my point here is that making a Japanese sword is a very complex process. It is a sequential process in which the success of the step is highly dependent on the success of the previous step. It is very costly. It takes years of apprenticeship. It has a high failure rate. And all these things make in sword that innovation is a very risky proposal. So much so that the steps that I've just described have remained essentially the same for 30 generations. Okay? And I think this example, and the example that I've mentioned before, suggests that at the very least, the distribution of cultural rates of change and the distribution of biological rates of change are overlapping distribution. And assessing the extent to which that is true is what I'm trying to do here. So what I did is I compare rates of change in human technologies, so rates of change in the morphology of technologies as seen in the archaeological record, with rates of change in animal morphologies, so rates of phenotypic change, as seen in contemporary animal populations and in the fossil record. And in both cases, I've calculated rates using the same metric, the Darwin. So the Darwin was devised by Haldane in 1949, and it's been used ever since to calculate rates of biological change. So the Darwin is a standardized unit of change in factors of E, the base of the natural log per millions of years. Okay, so here x1 and x2 are the mean value of the trait at time 1 and at time 2, so the mean length of the mean foot size in the population at time 1 and the mean foot size in the population at time 2. And delta t is the amount of time between x1 and x2 in millions of years. Okay? And in terms of data, I've used a meta-analysis approach. So for the biological rates, I've collected rates in these two data sets which were analyzed in these two papers. So in total, I've got 503 rates of biological change coming from 28 studies, and coming from dozens of different species, so representing a wide range of cases. And in terms of archaeological cultural rates, I've computed rates from the archaeological literature. And this is not the whole data set. This is just to illustrate the kind of rates that I have. But in total, I've got 573 rates of change coming from 26 studies. So again, representing a wide range of cases. And now you might think that I can just go on and compare these rates to the biological rates and test for statistically significant difference between the two sets of rates. But things are a bit more complicated than that. So biologists have found out that rates of biological evolution are inversely correlated with the time interval over which they are measured. Okay? So this is a chart that was published by Gingerich in a paper in Science in which he reports that finding. So here you're looking at rates of change in Darwin as a function of the time interval over which they are measured on a log-log scale. And you can see that rates of change measured over a short time interval are much larger than rates of change measured over a longer time interval. And this is surprising because when you divide the amount of change by time, what you're doing, what you think you're doing is you are getting rid of the effect of time interval. So why is it that these rates are dependent on time interval? A couple of reasons that I'm going to present to you the two main reasons, and these are related processes. So first, as time interval increases, it becomes increasingly likely that the rate observed is actually average over several evolutionary reversals. Okay? And at very high rates of change, like this thing here, can only be observed over a short time interval. Okay? And then rates of change have delta t as a denominator, so they are proportional to 1 over delta t. But now, because of the effect of things like stabilizing selection and morphological constraint, morphological change will rarely be proportional to delta t. So basically, time is free to vary here, but morphological change is bounded, is constrained. And this explains why, when you go back in the fossil record, the pace of evolution seems to change. And what this means here is that if you want to control, if you want to compare groups of rates, you have to control for the effect of time interval. And one way to do that is to do like Gingerich did, that is, plot the rates against time interval, and then use the model that best describes the data to compare groups of rate at this, over similar time scale. So this is what I did here. So you're looking at rate again against time interval in a log-log scale. And in red, you've got the cultural rate. And in blue, you've got the biological rates. And you can see that cultural rates are also inversely correlated with the time interval over which they are measured. And because as you go back in the archaeological record, the record gets coarser, sites get destroyed, etc. The typical time interval also increases, meaning that rates of technological change are also inversely correlated with their age. Okay? And this is why you look at the material culture around you, things are changing pretty quickly. And when you think about the material culture at the time of your grandparents, and it really feels like things were changing more slowly at that time. And if you go back enough in time, what you're going to see is mostly stone tool traditions that do not change for thousands of years. So stasis, exactly like in the fossil record. And I think that one of the reasons why we see that is because of the effect of time interval. It is because we are not observing these different periods of our history using the same observational scale. And that, if you were to control for the effect of time interval, much of that temporal variation in rates would disappear. And you can also see that the typical difference between cultural and biological rates increases with time. And this suggests that cultural evolution, just like biological evolution, is a multiplicative process. That is, instead of changing following an absolute rate of change, it's changing following a proportional rate of change. So as a trait gets larger, so does the increment of change. So you can think of this as two bank accounts with different interest rates, but here culture has a higher interest rate than biological evolution. So both models converge at the scale of a 1 month time interval. So over a 1 month time interval, the pace of biological evolution, the pace of cultural evolution seems to be the same. And that corresponds to a ratio between the final and initial value of the trait of 1.01. So on average, things have changed by 1%. But if you look at over larger time interval, like 1,000 years, so the scale of much of the climatic fluctuation in the Pleistocene, you can see that cultural rates are much more rapid than biological rates of change. And so is the change ratio. So 42% against 6% for culture. So what does this tell us? Well, first this tells us that even when controlling for the effect of time interval, cultural evolution is faster than biological evolution, except over a very short time scale. And my interpretation of this is that if you were to take two populations, one with a capacity for culture and one without it, and if you were to pit these two populations, again, the same ecological challenge, at the beginning, both populations will do just the same, but give them enough time, and the population with the capacity for culture will do better. They will do increasingly better with time. So this could mean that some of the adaptive benefits of culture are reaped over a long time scale. And this, to me, this is an unexpected result, and to me it illustrates the utility of an archaeological perspective on patterns of cultural evolution. So, this is not something that you could easily see at an ethnographic scale. This is something that to really see, to detect, you really need the time depth of the archaeological record. So one of the ways by which archaeology can contribute to cultural evolution theories, beyond providing us with the history of our species, is by helping us parametrizing our microscale models of cultural evolution. And there's another thing that this chart tells us. So the minimum time interval over which you can observe biological change will depend in part on the generation time of the species. And all the rates here on the left side of this chart come from species with a very short generation time, so months or 1 year or 2, 3, 4 years. And interestingly enough, there are several cultural rates that have been observed over similar time scale. While biologically, the generation time of our species is 20, 25 years. And this is really one of the things that I think makes us such a powerful species. So culture allows us to evolve over very short time scales, which are normally only accessible to species with a short generation time. While at the same time, it lets us enjoy the benefits of long lifespan. So, invest in big bodies, large brain, extended childhood, to learn even more things. So culture frees us from the generation time constraint, and it gives us access to the best of both worlds. And I really think that this is one of the reasons why humans have come to dominate so many of the Earth's ecosystem. And the methods to study rates of change that I've outlined here can be applied, provides us with a framework to answer all sorts of questions about the pace of evolution. So for instance, one idea that's very common in social sciences and in the public in general is that the pace of technological innovation has been accelerating recently. So that our cell phones are evolving much more faster than anything we've seen before. So this might well be true, but given the fact that time interval will bias the kind of rates you can observe, it is plausible that controlling for the effect of time interval, you might find that iPhones are evolving as rapidly than Iroquois long houses, for instance. So what I did is I've collected rates of change in modern technologies, so classic things like the number of transistors on a microprocessor, but also the capacity of hard drive of personal computers, the battery lifespan of your iPod. And controlling for the effect of time interval, this is what I get here. So in orange, you've got the rates of change in these modern technologies. And in red, you've got the rates of change as observed in the fossil record. And you can see that even controlling for the effect of time interval, these technologies are indeed changing much more rapidly than anything we've seen before. And by the way, the fastest rates here are faster by many factors than the fastest biological rates observed in laboratory settings under selection experiments. So this result confirmed people's intuition about the pace of modern technological change. But now it also tells us how much faster these things are changing.
So there's a data point, a historical technology that's way up there with the modern. I'm just wondering what that is.
I've looked at that, but that was months ago. I'm sorry. It's something in the historical record.
Right.
Very recently, I think it's rates of change in the size of block prints of people when they use these manual print journals. I think it's changing the size of these blocks. I'm not sure. But now it also provides us with, so if you want to come up with an explanation for why these rates of the pace of technological evolution has accelerated recently, you have to come up with an explanation that can account for change of that magnitude here. And I've got a couple of ideas about what could explain that, and I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say on this. But one obvious explanation would be that these technologies are evolving in the context of modern market economy, which generates selective pressure that are uncharacteristically strong compared to the kind of selective pressure that typically prevailed in our prehistory. So there are huge payoffs and huge incentives today to come up with the thinnest, lightest cell phone. We live in societies with institutions like universities and DRMs, which are there to promote innovation. But let me propose a more contentious explanation, and here I'm just going to speculate here because it's fun. So I suspect that the archaeological record and the fossil record, for that matter, is biased towards slower rates of change. So we know, for instance, that the evolution of both animal morphologies and technologies is often marked by an initial period of very rapid dramatic change that is followed by a period of slower change and fine-tuning. So overall, it leads to a kind of an S-shaped developmental path. So here's an example of this. So this is the evolution of aircraft engine. So you've got a measure of the performance of aircraft engine in terms of a weight to power ratio, so pound per horsepower through time. And you can see that most of the change in that technology has occurred over in the first 10 years of it, okay? And so this was a period of trial and error, so people would make an engine and then they would fly it until it failed. And then if the engine survived the failure, they will disassemble it, figure out what went wrong, and then make a new engine with modifications. And then after that, you can see that the development of the technology kind of plateaus. So the reason why you've got this curvilinear path is that at first someone comes up with the innovation, and then it spreads, and then more and more people are aware of it, and more people are exploring the solution space for that technology. But eventually, the solution space for that technology has been well explored. So there's just not much room for improvement, unless there's going to be some technological breakthrough eventually. Now, if it is the case that this period of very rapid dramatic change happens at a smaller scale than the typical scale of the archaeological record, then this here will be invisible archaeologically. So what you're going to see mostly in the archaeological record is going to be this here. While for computer and electronic technologies, it's clear that we are still here, okay? And so this is an example of a difference between the scale of the archaeological record and the scale of the ethnographic record that cannot be controlled for with the methods that I've used previously. So this is something that should be kept in mind when archaeologists are testing ethnographically derived hypotheses in the archaeological record. And the question of the scale of the archaeological record and how it constrains the kind of research question we can ask to it, and how we can take advantage of that scale to contribute to cultural evolution theory are questions that I'm very interested in, and that I'm planning on working on in the next few years. So any comments would be appreciated. Now would be a good time for me to stop. So here, and thanks.